like I said before, Scott in San Jose, California.
Hello.
Hey.
Hey, yeah, I called a couple weeks ago and realized how hard it is to speak coherently in real time. And as a result, I'm going to be reading some of my opening comments. And since I want to talk in these comments about something you guys said and what other callers said, I'm going to be reading some quotes from them, if that's okay with you guys.
Well, I mean, let's focus on what you called in to talk about, because the notes say that you wanted to...
Well, it is what I called talk about.
Yeah, it said that you wanted to explain...
what I want to talk about, so...
Sorry? I missed the last thing that you said.
I said it is what I want to talk about, but I want to be coherent about what I want to talk about. And
Okay.
I want to talk about EF, and I want to talk about what you guys are doing and sort of leverage off EF to move into that.
All right, so tell me about what precepts... what they're really trying to say.
Oh, can I back up a second?
Sure.
A little higher than that? I want to begin by explaining why I'm calling. Hopefully by the end of the call it'll be clear why I think understanding why someone is saying something is critical to understanding what they're trying to say.
Okay.
And having said that, I'm calling because I see some of myself in you guys. I think you, like me, are trying to make the world a little better place. I think you, like me, believe that you have some insights that could help others get through this world a little better. I also see you guys making some of the same mistakes that I've made over the last 30 years, and I'm hoping by sharing some of the insights that I've come through, I can help you, help everybody else make this world a better place. No need to reinvent the wheel and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that sounds great. So what advice did you want to impart?
I see an irony and a paradox in that, right? In that I'm going to suggest to you how you can reach more people effectively, but in order to do that, I need to reach you. I need to persuade you to operate slightly differently than you currently do and to focus on slightly different things than it appears you're currently doing. And to do that, I want to start by explaining EF. Show why his position is ridiculous and not even worth spending a moment of time pondering, and use that as a jumping off point to what we really want to do.
Okay, so
does that make sense?
So to be clear, you'd like to point out that presuppositional apologetics are not worth our time, and we should move on?
Yes, by explaining what they are and the base point of that. And because when I was listening to, it was you and the other guest. What was his name? A week ago, 2 weeks ago?
I can't keep when we had guests straight. Was it me and Eric?
No, it was before you and Eric.
Oh, Thomas. It was me and Thomas.
Thomas, yeah. And so basically, I'll read the quote directly from EF. He says, "Do you accept that there is something fundamentally absolute and provides for all contingencies such as evidence and causality?" And what he's asking there, and like I said, it's ridiculous position. He's asking how we know that the universe is consistent. That cause and effect assumes, he's saying cause and effect assumes a consistent universe, and it comes down to base measurements, right? If, for example, we place a rock on a scale to measure its mass, how do we know that mass is not random? How do I know that if I how do I know that I'll have the same mass from one moment to the next? How do I know that there are next moments?
Yeah.
And it's not a question of scale of calibration of the scale. It's not a question of whether there's contamination to the thing we measured. It's a question of whether that thing itself is consistent throughout time, and whether time exists. And he's saying, how do you know that, right?
Yeah.
Because I thought you and Thomas kept trying to go back to first causes, and it's not a first cause, right?
Yeah,
it's how do I know that? And the universe is not going to just randomly change on me. And to be fair to Thomas, he did have this one statement. He says they could alter the algorithms. They could make it so that when we pick up this bottle of water, it just melts and falls right through and completely violates the laws of physics as far as I know. As everything around me that I've observed, never seen that happen. So I operate where I could go based off the patterns, but I cannot make a straight up bold claim that it's not going to be the case 100% of the time.
Yeah.
It is 99.999% of the time, blah, blah, blah. And so he's on to it right there. He's on to the basic point, but you guys spent like 45 minutes, trying to argue. But that's the point, and that's how do we know the universe is consistent?
We don't.
And yeah, well,
I mean,
and that's why I want to jump off. That's why I want to jump off.
Yeah, let me just throw some background because I know that Shelley wasn't here, and I don't think that presuppositional apologetics are a secret hobby that you have.
No.
Yeah, don't worry, they're not worth your time. But so it's effectively if a person is presupposing that, okay, well, based on my observations, I can test things, and if you presuppose that logic is logical and you move from there, you're able to get around in the world. And the objection that presuppositional apologetics presents is, well, that's irrational, that's circular. The reason that I know that logic is logical is because God makes it so. And the problem that their argument has is that instead of presupposing that logic is logical, they're presupposing that God makes logic logical, which is adding another part of their worldview that is unnecessary and even more unsupported. And then when you point that out and push further and they say, oh yes, and I know that God makes logic logical because the Bible, and you point out, well, if you're saying that you can believe the Bible because the Bible says you should believe the Bible, that you have it, that it's circular, the phrase that comes up from time to time, depending on which presuppositional apologist you're talking to, is a vicious circle versus a virtuous circle, which is effectively, which leans into special pleading of, no, when I'm saying that my argument about God is circular, that's good, but your argument, when it takes the same form about anything else, is bad. So there's a lot to unpack there, and usually the argument dances around and throws sand in your face by using phrases like non-contingent and predetermined instead of stating plainly arguments and conclusions in the way that I've just done, is the way that I would summarize this. And so then when you're engaging with a presuppositional apologist, that's the basis where, that's the dance floor where you're both going to tango, and you just have to figure out which steps you're going to take. At least that would be my summary, if that makes sense to you, Scott.
Oh, yeah, it makes sense to me, which leads me to my next question.
Does that make a lot of sense? Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
Good
All right.
explanation. Thanks.
That's what I do.
And this is, it's a non-rhetorical question, a honest question.
Hey.
Why do you do what you do?
Because I believe that it helps people.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Is the justification. People, right? But on a more selfish note, I enjoy what I do. Yeah.
But why do you speak? Why do you engage in conversation? What are you expecting to happen by words leaving your mouth?
Do you mean on the show? I mean, it varies. But
Ever,
do you mean on the show?
What do you expect to happen? Yeah.
So it's a combination of informative, first and foremost, and then I attempt to communicate things that I think are helpful and informative through conversations in a way that is also generally entertaining.
Yeah, but when you make it, when you utter words, right, there's expectations about the other, right, about other minds, and that they can hear and receive these things you're saying. They can understand what you're saying. Mm-hmm. These things represent ideas that are common in the world, and we can share them. Mm-hmm. I mean, these are basic assumptions we make. We never think about them when we make these things, but they are assumptions, right?
Yeah. So if you're asking if contained within that question is the possibility of when you talk to a caller on the line, do you believe that you can persuade them to take a second look at their beliefs?
That's a small part of it, because you're also talking to a broader audience, right? So you're talking to them too while you're talking to the caller, right?
Exactly.
So there's multiple goals in mind, right?
Yes.
And so,
I mean, I can reiterate that, but that is true.
Yes. What happens, though, if you're engaging with a caller who is not interested in reaching common understanding? If their primary motivation, because it also assumes that our primary motivations, or at least the majority of our primary motivations, including your listeners, are
honest,
trying to understand the world better, and trying to understand it accurately, right?
I agree.
Is that another assumption we're making?
Yes. I mean, this isn't a biology classroom, so you don't really learn that much, but you certainly, I would hope, get better ideas about having conversations and perhaps why people believe what they believe or what they're likely to say when you ask them a question. When you say, when you refer to an assumption of honest discourse, if you want to talk about presuppositional apologetics and it being, in general, a dishonest way of badgering your way forward about worldviews and presuppositions and a way of filling the air with noise such that you can then feel justified in saying, yes, I believe and I'm good at arguing, then yes, I would say that that is an accurate description of how dishonest presuppositional apologetics are.
Okay, I guess I would want to drill down on that question of what you mean by honest then.
So I feel like
usually assumes that the person knows they're being dishonest, but what happens if they don't?
It does.
It's
a really interesting thing to think about, and I don't really know how to classify it. I think we have to expand our ideas about honest discourse and dishonest discourse, because at a certain point, a person has been not quite so dishonest to themselves, but has warped the way that they communicate about this specific topic and communicate we'll take the example of presuppositional apologetics in such a way that it's not correct to call it dishonest in a like, oh, you're lying, you know that you are being dishonest, oh, you know you are gaslighting, whatever. It's not dishonest in that regard. It's just that I think that presuppositional apologists have lost the connection to what discourse and epistemology are and should be, such that they're not able to engage in the way that we would describe as honest. So I think basically what we've found is a type of human communication and thought that you can't describe as dishonest, even though it is decidedly not honest, right? It's not approaching a conversation with an open and congenial mind, right? And that gets lost somewhat because when you engage in formal debate, you're debating for the audience rather than just for each other. And that is the only place that presuppositional apologetics can exist. This argument will befuddle and possibly make someone who is inclined to think, oh yeah, there's definitely a reason for my faith or for my belief in my specific God, I just don't know what it is. Oh look, here's a presuppositional apologist saying something befuddling, that must be justification for my faith, right? But it's never going to persuade someone to follow through with this reason that wouldn't otherwise believe, if that makes sense. At least that's the way that I see it working.
Oh, I absolutely agree with you there. But the one place I would differ is that, as you stated, your goal is also to talk to your audience and the rest of your audience and help them understand the world better, so hopefully make it a little bit better place for them to live in and to experience. And I think if we pointed out, well, you got the microphone, not me, on a regular basis, but if we pointed out that the motivation behind why these folks, the presuppositions, are doing what they're doing, it would help our collective understanding a lot better about what we're dealing with in this world. Because, you know, when you said they were possibly dishonest and you can't come up with a way to figure out what dishonesty is, I think you're onto something, because it's neither dishonest, because I think it's not just the communication, it's the way of thinking, it's the way of understanding the world.
That is not.
It's not what?
No. It is a way of understanding the world. The way of understanding the world that is engaged in that thinking is not understanding the world, is the point I was attempting to make in a flippant comment.
But at the risk of being very offensive to some people out in the world, the question is, why do you think, or I think it behooves us to think about why they need to think about the world in this way, why they need to create a personal narrative why they need to convince themselves. Because I'm quite convinced, I'm getting up there in age, and I've seen this a lot, and I'm quite convinced that people like EF, although he said directly, he called to show you that your position is incoherent. I think he's fooling himself. He's trying to convince himself that his position is coherent.
Yeah,
he's trying to come up with a reason to justify what he needs to believe. His entire motivation, his rationality is completely motivated. If that makes sense.
So here's what I will say.
To an extreme.
Yeah.
And it verges on, I hate to use this term because I've studied it a lot and I don't, but it verges on crazy. If we, like, for example, would you argue with the schizophrenic who's yelling at the wall on the street? No.
So there's a difference. If you're talking about
would
a person,
you argue with,
if you're talking about a person with a chemical imbalance, you're talking about a biological or neurological problem. I don't think that.
Yeah, but it's all exactly. That's why I was very hesitant.
I would say that there's a different category. So, for example, you wouldn't jump out and surprise someone with PTSD, but the thing that is affecting them and their behavior is not a chemical imbalance. Yeah. They're not tripping on acid or whatever. It's an effect.
Can you back up and say it again? You wouldn't surprise a person with PTSD. Why?
Oh, because it would negatively affect them, right? Like you wouldn't. I don't know whether trigger is the right word, but you wouldn't.
But you came off that previously saying you wouldn't do that to someone chemically imbalanced, and almost it seemed like the implication was that PTSD was chemically imbalanced.
To be clear, no. Thank you for catching that. If I miscommunicated that, no, my point is that it is not. It is a thing that negatively affects a person's life and affects the way that they interact with the world on a very fundamental level mentally. But you wouldn't say, oh, it is a chemical imbalance, right? Like there's a difference. I'm going to move away from PTSD because I don't know it well enough to talk about it. And for anyone with PTSD who feels that I've misrepresented them or what they've been through and that I've harmed, I apologize. Let me move to the general where I can more safely speak, which is that if there are mental health concerns that can be treated with therapy and therapy alone. But, for example, a person who has, I forget what the name of the disorder is, but it leads you to believe that you are dead. And it is the result purely of a chemical imbalance and is not something that can be treated by therapy alone. Then you have something in a very different category. I don't think that even if in future years, hyper-fundamentalist believers, like, so for example, there's an old call on the Atheist Experience where someone called in and they were talking about how they were talking with their imam. And at one point in time, they were pushing their imam on, would you believe anything that your religion said? Would you believe anything that your religion said? And what they reported, the response that they got was, if I looked outside and it was sunny, and my religion told me it was raining, I would believe that it was raining. So if at some point in time in the future there's a psychological classification for that, I don't think it will be something that is the result of a chemical imbalance. I think it will be something that is the result of indoctrination and sort of social indoctrination and childhood indoctrination rather than a chemical imbalance. Because there's people like, you can take whatever, bath salts or some other really strong drugs that will, really mess you up in some bad ways. I shouldn't use bath salts as an example because I'm also not a chemist. But I am currently under the impression that there are drugs strong enough that they can permanently, that they have the potential to permanently imbalance someone's brain chemistry. I do not think that fundamentalist Christianity is that. I don't think it's a chemical imbalance in the brain. And I've now spent far too long saying what I could have said in one sentence.
So Scott, are you saying that they shouldn't talk to people that, that are not arguing rationally?
No, not really. I'm saying that given there are multiple purposes to doing what you're doing, right?
Yeah.
You have multiple goals in doing what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And if one of those goals is to help everybody else listening understand this particular person and what they're doing, focusing on irrational argument is not going to serve that goal very well. What you could do is talk about why this person is calling. And, because when he did say why he was calling, and he said it was to show you that
your worldview is...
You could have at that point, and I don't want to micromanage every word you say because that's just...
Well, I mean, I feel free to entirely ignore you, so give me the advice that you want.
Exactly. You do, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. But I think if you... I would suggest that if you can focus on those points more often, it's like, okay, there was a time to say, okay, but you're failing miserably. Now where do we go from here? Mm-hmm. You said you're going to convince me of this, but you're not trying to convince me at all, are you? Because you're calling me cupcake or whatever that, fruit cake, whatever.
Yeah, there was that
back. He's not trying to convince you.
Yeah, he was.
Point out these obvious contradictions in their statements versus what has to be their motivation, I think goes a long ways to helping the rest of us understand the world we're dealing with and to understand religion, to understand the religious thinker.
So I agree.
And this is where I disagree with Eric.
Oh, okay.
And I disagree kind of with you because you were putting forth at least a semi-ghost in the machine argument of the human mind. Because you were saying some things are chemical imbalances, while other things aren't. But it's kind of true that all brain is chemistry.
That's true.
Right?
So
all our thoughts are chemistry, and so distinguish for me what's a chemical imbalance versus what is a psychological or religious influence versus just something that came in through the meme of language. It's really, really hard to distinguish between those two. I'm not saying it's impossible. Maybe it's a spectrum. But
allow me to say this very quickly. So two things. One, I would just like to take the note that it is important and helpful to understand whether your interlocutor, the person that you're discussing or debating with, is arguing honestly, because it will help you understand when, if, why, how they're going to say what they're saying or why they said what they said. However, simply because a person doesn't believe the argument that they're making or wasn't persuaded themselves by the argument doesn't mean that the argument itself cannot hold water, as it were.
No, that's
so,
true,
for example, whether or not the defense attorney thinks his client is innocent is irrelevant. If he makes an objection and it's valid in the law, it needs to be upheld. That kind of thing. Yeah. However, but understanding a dishonest interlocutor, a person who's not actually there to engage with you, who's there effectively to joust at what they see as an atheist windmill, is helpful because it will help you understand whether or not appeals to, have I heard you correctly? Are you understanding this? Are you following me? Why don't you want to talk about this? Those things are important to understand how the conversation is going to go and how you're going to engage with it. So I agree with you on that point.
But it also helps you understand why the confusion exists in the first place.
Yes.
Because
it's deliberate.
It is the motivated reasoning that forces one to twist the world and to twist one's world narrative into these undecipherable pretzels that make no sense to anybody outside their own minds. And when we understand,
I would go a step further and say it doesn't make sense to them either.
Them to do this, we understand them a lot better. We understand our own self a lot better. And if I can, I want to jump off to a slightly different topic, and this one should. Well, it's not the same topic.
We're very very slim on time. What is the topic that you want to jump to and how?
It's about the same thing. It's about how we do these same things, our side of this aisle. And I'm going to suggest that you guys, Eric, and both you have shown motivated reasoning. And one of the things I'll point out, I'll just pull out one quote, for example, and how a need to be something other than. I don't know how to say
here,
this.
how about we'll do this. So really quick, Scott, hold on. So Eric will be back on next week with me.
Well, this is you and Thomas. The quotes are from you and Thomas.
Yeah. But we're actually really slim on time, and so I need to hop off this call. But I think you should call back again next week. These may not be the most exciting or, verbal confrontation calls for the audience. However, I think they're incredibly valuable because it's an examination in clearer terms of what presuppositionalist arguments and arguments that are entirely motivated reasoning, fashioned out of whole cloth that doesn't exist because nothing can come into existence from anything and is fundamentally pre-undetermined, etc. There's me doing an homage to his kind of reasoning.